Imagine standing at the edge of a steel ramp, ocean spray hitting your face, the deafening roar of engines all around you. You're 21 years old. You've never seen combat. The ramp drops open, and in the next 30 seconds, everything you thought you knew about bravery, about life, will be completely destroyed. This is D-Day. June 6th, 1944. The largest seaborne invasion in the history of human warfare, the day the world held its breath, and the day that changed everything. But to understand how we got here, to understand why 156,000 young men crossed the English Channel to storm a heavily fortified coastline, we have to go back. Back to a Europe that had fallen completely under the shadow of one man.
Du meine Arbeit für richtig hältst, ob du glaubst, dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich gearbeitet habe, dass ich mich in diesen Jahren für dich eingesetzt habe, dass ich anständig meine Zeit verwendet habe im Dienste meines Volkes. Gib du jetzt deine Stimme ab. Wenn ja, dann tritt für mich ein, so wie ich für dich eingetreten bin.
By 1942, Adolf Hitler controlled almost all of continental Europe. France had fallen in just 6 weeks in 1940. A humiliation so complete, so swift, that the world was left in stunned silence. Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, all under the Nazi boot. The Soviet Union was being torn apart on the Eastern Front. Britain stood alone, battered by German bombs night after night, refusing to break. Hitler had built what he called Fortress Europe. Along the northern coastline of France, from Norway all the way down to the Spanish border, the Germans constructed the Atlantic Wall. Over 2,600 miles of bunkers, gun emplacements, landmines, steel obstacles, and barbed wire. Millions of tons of concrete, thousands of artillery pieces pointing out to sea. Hitler believed it was impenetrable. His generals told him nothing could get through. He was almost right. The Allied commanders, General Dwight D. Eisenhower leading the whole operation, British General Bernard Montgomery directing ground forces, knew that breaching the Atlantic Wall would come at a devastating cost. They needed the element of surprise more than they needed almost anything else. And so they cooked up one of the greatest deceptions in military history. It was called Operation Fortitude, and it was breathtaking in its audacity. The Allies created an entire fake army, the first United States Army Group, and placed it in southeast England, directly across the Channel from Pas de Calais, the narrowest crossing point. They built inflatable rubber tanks, fake aircraft made of plywood, fake oil depots, fake landing craft bobbing in rivers. They even sent fake radio traffic, hundreds of hours of military communications for German intelligence to intercept and decode. And those communications all pointed to one place, Pas de Calais. To make it even more convincing, they needed a famous face to lead this phantom army. They chose General George S. Patton, the most feared American commander the Germans knew of. Patton drove around southeast England, attended staged events, was spotted by German spies. The Germans were convinced. When the real invasion came, Hitler would hold his panzer divisions back for weeks, certain the Normandy landing was just a feint. They also had help from the inside. A network of double agents, turned by British intelligence, fed false information directly to Nazi high command. One of them, codenamed Garbo, ran an entire fictional spy network out of London. The Germans trusted him completely. He told them Normandy was a distraction. They believed him. The real target was a 50-mile stretch of coastline in Normandy, France. 5 beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The date was set, June 5th, 1944. But then the weather turned. A brutal Atlantic storm rolled in, waves crashing, wind howling. Eisenhower stood in a stone manor house in southern England, listening to his chief meteorologist tell him the weather might clear on June 6th. One narrow window, maybe 36 hours of acceptable conditions. The largest invasion force ever assembled sat waiting, Ships packed with soldiers, planes loaded with paratroopers, tanks, trucks, artillery, ammunition, enough equipment to fill a small country, and 156,000 young men trying not to think about what came next. The night before the invasion, the waiting was almost unbearable. Men wrote letters home, some wrote to their mothers, some wrote to girlfriends they hadn't seen in 2 years. Some couldn't write at all. They just sat in silence, staring at the floor of the transport ship, rosary beads wrapped around their fingers. Private Harold Baumgarten, 19 years old, from New York City, would later say he thought about his family's deli on the Upper West Side. The smell of fresh bread, his mother's voice. He wondered if he'd ever hear it again. Eisenhower himself drove to visit the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, on the evening of June 5th. He walked among them, shaking hands, asking their names, looking into their eyes. He smiled, he joked, but after he left, one of his aides saw tears on his face. Eisenhower had read the planning estimates. He knew that airborne casualty rates could reach 70%. He had just looked into the faces of thousands of men he might be sending to their deaths, and he had given the order anyway. At 11 p.m. on June 5th, the planes roared into the dark sky. Over 13,000 American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne, followed by British and Canadian forces. Their mission was to land behind German lines, secure the flanks of the invasion beaches, capture key bridges and road junctions, and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coast. Simple on paper, absolute chaos in reality. The planes flew into heavy anti-aircraft fire over the Normandy coast. Pilots swerved and dove to avoid being shot down. Formation after formation broke apart in the darkness. Paratroopers were dropped miles from their intended landing zones, some into flooded fields the Germans had deliberately inundated, where men drowned in 4 feet of water, weighted down by 80 pounds of equipment. Others landed in trees, in town squares, on rooftops. Small groups of men, lost and alone in enemy territory, found each other by sound. A small metal clicker, like a child's toy, issued to every paratrooper. One click back, friend. The chaos was everywhere. But in one extraordinary moment near the town of Sainte-Mère-Église, a dummy paratrooper named Private John Steele had his parachute catch on the church steeple and hung there for over 2 hours, playing dead, watching the battle unfold beneath him as German soldiers ran through the streets below. He survived. The town of Sainte-Mère-Église would become the first French town liberated that day, taken not by a planned assault, but by scattered paratroopers fighting in the dark, using flashlights and clickers to find each other in the hedgerows. Dawn came slowly. At 6:30 in the morning, the naval bombardment began. Hundreds of Allied warships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers unleashed an unimaginable wall of fire against the German coastal fortifications. For nearly an hour, the Normandy coast disappeared in smoke and flame. Then the bombardment stopped. The ramps went down. At Utah Beach, the westernmost American landing zone, something remarkable happened. The current pushed the landing craft off course, roughly 2,000 yards south of their intended position. They landed in a lightly defended sector by complete accident. Casualties were relatively low. The beach was secured within hours. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of President Teddy Roosevelt, the oldest man on the beaches that day at 56 years old, stood on the sand under fire and declared, "We'll start the war from right here." He would be awarded the Medal of Honor. At Gold, Juno, and Sword, the British and Canadian beaches, the fighting was brutal, but the Allies made steady progress. Canadian troops at Juno suffered some of the highest casualty rates of the day in the initial assault, storming through fortified beach exits in the face of murderous machine gun fire. By afternoon, Canadian soldiers had pushed further inland than any other Allied force, reaching close to the main road between Bayeux and Caen. The British at Sword Beach were fighting toward the city of Caen, a key objective. At Gold, British forces would link up with Canadians by nightfall, beginning to stitch together a continuous Allied front. But at Omaha Beach, nothing was going right. Omaha was a 5-mile stretch of gently curved sand, backed by bluffs rising 100 to 170 feet above the waterline. To reach those bluffs, soldiers had to cross open beach. In some places, 300 yards of flat, exposed sand, with nowhere to hide. The Germans had turned this natural killing ground into a fortress. Concrete bunkers with overlapping fields of fire. Machine gun nests that could sweep the entire beach. Artillery pre-aimed at the water's edge. Thousands of steel obstacles in the surf zone, many tipped with mines. The men going into Omaha had been told the naval bombardment would destroy most of the defenses. It hadn't. The bombers, fearing they might hit their own troops, had released their payloads too late. Bombs fell miles inland, doing almost nothing to the German fortifications. The DD tanks, Sherman tanks, fitted with flotation screens designed to swim ashore and provide covering fire, were launched too far out in rough seas. 27 of the 32 tanks assigned to the first wave sank immediately. The men inside drowned. The landing craft approached the shore. German machine gunners opened fire before the ramps even dropped. When the ramps fell, men stepped off into nothing. The landing craft had stopped in deep water. Soldiers wearing 60 to 80 pounds of gear simply went under. Some drowned 10 yards from the ramp. Others struggled to the surface and tried to swim. The current dragged them sideways. Bodies began floating in the surf. Those who made it to the sand found themselves in a nightmare. There was no cover. Anywhere they stood, they died. Men pressed themselves flat against the sand, face down, and didn't move. A sergeant named John Ellery crawled behind a steel beach obstacle and lay there for 30 minutes while bullets pinged off the metal 6 inches above his head, telling himself over and over, "Move! You have to move! If you stay here, you die anyway." Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, almost entirely men from the small town of Bedford, Virginia, was decimated in minutes. In that first wave, Bedford lost more men per capita than any other community in America on D-Day. They call it the Bedford Boys. 19 men from one small town, dead in less than 30 minutes on a beach 4,000 miles from home. By 8 a.m., the situation at Omaha was critical. Senior commanders offshore, watching through binoculars as men piled up on the waterline and in the surf, began sending back the worst possible message. The landing was failing. There was a real possibility that Omaha would have to be abandoned, that the entire western flank of the invasion would collapse, that D-Day itself might fail. And then something happened that no general ordered, no officer planned. It happened because individual human beings, cold, terrified, bleeding, watching their friends die around them, refused to stop. Small groups of soldiers, led by sergeants and junior officers, began moving. Not toward the water, not back to the ships, toward the bluffs. Sergeant William Stivison, Captain Joseph Dawson, Colonel George Taylor, who stood on the beach in the open fire and shouted words that have echoed through history. 2 kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here. Men began cutting through wire, climbing draws, the narrow gullies that cut through the bluffs, scaling the cliffs with bare hands and bayonets stuck into the earth. The Rangers at Point du Hoc, a separate assault, used grappling hooks and ropes to climb 100-foot sheer cliffs under fire to destroy what they believed were massive artillery guns. They found the gun emplacements empty. The guns had been moved inland, and they found and destroyed them anyway. One by one, the German positions began to fall from the flanks and from above. The destroyers offshore, 7 of them, made a decision that wasn't in their orders. They came in so close to shore that they risked running aground, their keels scraping the bottom, and used their guns at point-blank range to blast German bunkers directly. Sailors watching through gun sights could see individual German soldiers. The fire was devastating. It broke the back of the German defense on the western end of the beach. By noon, American soldiers controlled the bluffs above Omaha Beach. It had cost nearly 2,000 casualties in a single morning. The sand was red. The surf was red. But the beach was American. By nightfall, on June 6, 1944, approximately 156,000 Allied troops were ashore in Normandy. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's supposedly impenetrable fortress, had been cracked open. The largest amphibious invasion in history had succeeded. Hitler, convinced by his own deception that the real invasion was still coming at Pas de Calais, held his Panzer Reserve divisions back for critical days. By the time he released them, it was too late. The Allies had established a beachhead they would never relinquish. The weeks that followed were brutal. The hedgerow fighting in Normandy, the bocage, was some of the most savage combat of the entire war. Soldiers fought field by field, village by village. But the momentum never shifted back to Germany. On July 25th, Operation Cobra broke the German lines completely. American tanks poured through the gap. By August 25th, less than 12 weeks after D-Day, Allied forces entered Paris. French General Charles de Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées as delirious crowds threw flowers and wept openly. France was free. The liberation rolled east: Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg. One by one, the countries Hitler had crushed in 1940 rose up from under the darkness. By May 8th, 1945, less than a year after those young men stepped off ramps into the surf at Normandy, Germany surrendered unconditionally. World War II in Europe was over. Of the 156,000 men who landed on D-Day, more than 4,400 were killed. Thousands more were wounded, captured, or went missing. Total Allied casualties in the Normandy campaign, from June to August 1944, exceeded 209,000. German casualties were approximately 200,000. Normandy's fields and villages still hold the remains of tens of thousands of men who never went home. At the American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, overlooking Omaha Beach, there are 9,388 marble crosses and stars of David. Each one is a life, a name, a mother, a story that ended on these bluffs, or in these fields, or in the cold water below. The veterans who survived rarely spoke about what they saw. For decades, men who had waded through the surf at Omaha, who had jumped from planes into the dark over Sainte-Mère-Église, who had climbed those cliffs at Pointe du Hoc. They came home, got jobs, raised families, and said almost nothing. Not because they had forgotten, because some things are too heavy to carry into ordinary life. Stephen Ambrose, who spent years interviewing D-Day veterans, said that when the men finally began to talk, in their 70s and 80s, knowing they were running out of time, they almost never talked about heroism. They talked about the guy next to them, the buddy who shielded them from a burst of fire, the friend who didn't make it out of the surf. They said, "Don't call me a hero. Call the ones who didn't come back the heroes." Today, fewer than 10,000 American D-Day veterans are still alive. The youngest are in their late 90s. Every year, the number shrinks. Every year, another voice goes quiet. Another living link to that morning. To the ramp dropping, to the cold water, to the sound of the machine guns on the bluffs, disappears. On the 40th anniversary of D-Day, President Ronald Reagan stood at the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc and spoke directly to the aging Rangers who had climbed those cliffs in 1944, who now sat in their 60s, in wheelchairs and on canes, listening. He said, "These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war." They were just boys, really, Most of them had never been further from home than the next county. They crossed an ocean, climbed into the darkness, and chose, in the most terrifying moments of their lives, to keep moving forward. Not because they wanted glory, because it needed to be done, because someone had to. The world we live in, the free world, the open borders, the democracies, the right to speak and vote and dissent. None of it was inevitable. None of it was guaranteed. On June 6, 1944, it was hanging by a thread. And on a cold, gray, blood-soaked beach in northern France, a generation of young men grabbed that thread and pulled the world back from the abyss. Remember them.